SI joint pain is a pretty common symptom that many practitioners of yoga describe. During this time, this pain was often so bad it would keep me up at night. It was the type of pain that limited what I could do. It also was disturbing in the sense that a lot of what I was hearing about the SI joint during that time painted the SI joint as this very fragile joint, as this joint that could kind of slip out of place, that could be dysfunctional. And so, of course, because I had SI joint pain, I just assumed that my SI joint was dysfunctional and unstable. Those beliefs about my SI joint pain certainly didn't decrease my pain. Let's just put it that way. And so what I did at the time is I used the tool that I was trained to use, that I felt it was my, job to use to help my students, which was I tried to fix my alignment. I went through all of the poses that I felt kind of were what I would call like the pain culprits. I would have like flare-ups of pain after doing these particular poses, and I tried to fix the way I was aligning my pelvis in those poses. I figured out that, maybe the ways that I was doing it in the past were bad, and so I tried doing those poses in new ways. And while sometimes that would decrease the symptoms of pain, it never really eliminated the reoccurrence of the pain. It would always eventually come back. Eventually, then I just started to eliminate whole poses from my practice, assuming that they were just bad for me, all the while assuming that my body, my SI joint was somehow not robust or strong enough to be able to sustain the loads of those poses. During this time, I definitely considered myself an anatomy enthusiast, and I took what I would describe as a little bit more mechanistic view of the body, and assuming that we could maybe think of the body more like a building, in that the way that we structure the body determines its stability. The way that the body breaks down is being similar to the way like a car breaks down, and these kind of mechanistic views would lead me to like very simple singular solutions to pain, which was I'll just stop doing the thing that hurts. And then I started to understand more about the science of biomechanics and about how loads play into the way that our bodies adapt, and then also the way that they're able to respond to loads being things like yoga poses or walking or running or jumping. And I started to understand the concept of forces, which a load is really a force acting on the body, but forces and like the magnitude of forces. And I had to eventually reckon with the fact that actually running or even just jumping, the amount of forces that my SI joint has to manage in those activities are actually greater probably than the forces that it's having to manage in a pose like warrior one or triangle pose. And then I was like, well, wait a second. If I can run and walk, and that's not contributing to my SI joint pain. In fact, it actually helped my SI joint pain because I wasn't doing a whole lot of walking and running during that time. So when I would go on walks or would go on runs, I would notice that it would actually help me feel better. And if the forces that I'm managing in walking and running are actually greater than the ones I'm managing in triangle pose, then wait, is my SI joint unstable? How come my SI joint can manage the forces of running, but then it hurts when I do triangle pose? And that's where I had to reckon with some cognitive dissonance and realize that like there were some gaps in my understanding about the human body. And the biggest one was that my SI joint pain wasn't the result of an unstable SI joint. In fact, the SI joint is an inherently stable joint. Think about it. It really has to be. It has to be able to manage forces that are transferred from the ground all the way up to the spine. And that pain isn't an indication always of damage to biological tissues, and it's certainly the amount of pain doesn't correlate always to the amount of damage. In fact, what I had to realize was that maybe my pain was a symptom of a combination of overload, of doing a lot of one type of activity, a lot of asana, and then underload, not doing enough of all the other types of activities or exposing my hips, exposing my SI joint to the wider variety of loads that my nervous system really needed my SI joint and this whole area to be exposed to in order for it to feel safe, in order for it to be able to count on those tissues, those muscles' ability to really control my SI joint, my hip joint. So I had to kind of look beyond the asana practice then and recognize that the asana practice as a modality, while wonderful, might not be offering me a wide enough variety of loads. Because I love asana, because it's helped me in so many ways, I didn't want to just abandon it entirely. So I started asking myself, is there something that I could bring into my practice? Is there a way that I could kind of take a broader perspective of asana in general to see if there's a way that I can use my body, challenge my body in a wider variety of ways? And I happened upon some resistance bands, and I want to share with you actually an exercise that I found very helpful, and it's called monster walks. So you can take a mini band. This is a heavy mini band. You can use a lighter variety. You can even maybe find heavier varieties than this particular one that I'm using. Placing the band around the lower part of the thighs, just above the knees, and then coming into kind of a low squat. So I'd do a little hip hinge here and then bend my knees. Of course, the resistance band is trying to drag my knees inward. So I have to work my hip abductors, my glutes, as well as my hip lateral rotators to press my thighs out against that resistance. And then I can just start to walk sideways around the room, and as I increase the distance or the gap between my legs, the band's resistance actually feels stronger, so I have to work a little harder as I step wide. Now, we do definitely in the asana practice expose our abductors and our lateral rotators to types of work and standing poses and in other poses, but it's a combination of body geometry, the shape that I'm in, as well as how much load am I exposing those muscles to. Is it just my body weight? Is it some portion of my body weight? Is it always within the same joint angles? And when we look at the asana practice as a whole, we might start to understand how it can be in some ways very repetitive. For example, in the standing poses, we're oftentimes in a kind of end range position of hip abduction, and one hip's externally rotated or one hip's always extended, and we're kind of, sometimes if we subscribe to this idea that there's one correct alignment, we're always kind of trying to do the same exact shape in that pose. If you notice here in monster walks, I'm not in end range position. I'm working against external load. That makes it different. But then I'm also kind of taking these different patterns around the room. I might even turn it into a monster curtsy. And I'm exposing this joint to the types of joint angles and also external load that I simply just don't expose it to as much in the yoga practice, right? In the asana practice. So this is one way that you could bring something really simple, like a little mini band, into the yoga space and start to move differently, right? Not only am I moving differently, but also load differently. After doing some of this work that I learned from hitting the gym and through exposure to some of the wisdom of the strength and conditioning world, I ended up being able to go back to those poses that I thought were the cause of my pain. And not only did they not create the symptoms of pain anymore, but they actually felt great. I could even do poses that I had been doing what I thought was bad alignment or faulty alignment, and I could go back to those same types of ways of aligning my body in those poses. And I still wouldn't have these flare-ups of symptoms of pain as a result of that bad alignment. What I learned is that in order to increase my body's level of resilience and tolerance for loads, I had to look beyond this idea of there being good and bad alignment or good and bad poses, and instead seek to diversify and expand upon the ways in which I was loading my body in general. Definitely alignment is a component of that, but it's one part. It's not the main plot line.